There's a weird buzz.
Yeah, that buzz just started.
And it went away.
So I just want to welcome everybody. I know lots of people are coming onto the call. We're excited to get started in just a few minutes as more people come on. So sit tight and we'll be with you soon. This is Frances Kunreuther, and I want to welcome you to the call on the LGBT movement at the Crossroads, and a report that we recently released and will be starting soon. So sit tight. We'll be with you in a few minutes. And for those of you just coming on, this is Frances Kunreuther from the Building Movement Project. We're going to be starting in a couple of minutes as everybody joins the call. So just sit tight for a couple of minutes and we'll be starting the webinar. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be starting our webinar on the LGBT movement at the Crossroads in just a couple of minutes. Hello, this is Frances Kunreuther from the Building Movement Project. If you've just joined us, remember to dial into the audio. See, it's on the screen, that number there, so you can hear the webinar as well as going in through your computer. So you can see our slides. We're excited about the webinar today. We're happy you're joining us. Call in that number, and we'll be just starting in a couple of minutes. So remember to call in the number 866-740-1260, and the code is 633-1405, and press pound, and you should be joining this. You'll be on mute, but come on into the call. We're excited that you're with us, and we'll be getting started in just a minute or two.
Hi everybody, this is Rebecca Fox from Wellspring Advisors, and we're going to go ahead and get started with the call just to make sure that you're also viewing the slides at the same time because it will be following along. So this call is about the LGBT movement at the Crossroads. I'm going to do a brief introduction and then we're going to go through a bunch of speakers who I'll also be introducing and then doing some Q&A. So this webinar comes out of a report that Wellspring Advisors, where I work closely with the Building Movement Project to kind of determine what is next or what's on the horizon for the LGBT movement. We're going to get a little bit into how we define that because obviously it did not include all groups or all activists working on the topic, but really wanted to make sure that at this key movement moment that we were taking a second to assess where we are and where things are heading, especially as the LGBT movement really starting to win policy and legal victories, most recently the Supreme Court decision around DOMA and Proposition 8, and also as the movement is engaging in a larger conversation around the winning rights and policy victories versus the lived experience of LGBT people. And to do this, we worked closely with Building Movement Project, and the first person who I'm going to talk about is Frances Kunreuther, who is the founder and co-director of the Building Movement Project, which works to strengthen U.S. nonprofits as sites of social change. She's also a senior fellow at the Research Center for Leadership and Action at NYU. and working along with Frances was Gigi Barsoum, who is the founder of Barsoum Policy Consulting, which focuses on the development and evaluation of strategies for change that help nonprofit organizations and foundations succeed. She was formerly a policy manager at the California Endowment and has also worked at the U.S. Governmental Accountability Office in Washington, D.C. Also assisting was Barbara Masters, who has spent her career in public policy-related work, having worked in Capitol Hill and in local government. Most recently, she served as a public policy director at the California Endowment, the largest health foundation in California, and currently she runs her own consulting practice assisting foundations and nonprofits in developing and evaluating policy change and movement-building strategies. What else is going to be happening? So we're going to go through the report, what came out of it, and then we're going to be hearing from Urvashi Vaid, who actually feels a little ridiculous to introduce since I'm sure she is familiar to most of you on the phone. She's been a leader in the LGBT movement for more than 30 years. She's currently the director of the Engaging Tradition Project at the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia Law School. And this project seeks to understand how the idea of tradition is used by and used against movements for gender and sexual justice, and to explore how tradition-based practices inform, enable, and or limit the work of these movements. She's the author and editor of a number of books on the LGBT movement, and most recently wrote Irresistible Revolution, Confronting Race, Class, and the Assumptions of LGBT Politics, which is a collection of 9 essays. So just to recap, we're going to be going through the report, talking about slides, methodology. Urvashi is then going to respond to that. This entire webinar will be on mute for people who are not presenting, simply to avoid feedback. But if you'll look at the screen in front of you right now, you can be live tweeting this using hashtag BMPLive or hashtag LGBT Crossroads. You can also be typing the questions, comments, and technical issues here over in the box on the left side of your screen, where we will be getting questions. So again, if a presenter is speaking, you have a question, feel free to type that in, and then we will be going back to that. And I know I'm having some problems with my volume today, so this is me yelling, and I hope that it's working. The next thing I'm going to show you before turning it over to a fast polling question and then turning it over to Frances was really, again, the purpose of this. So it was to understand the domestic, so within the United States, LGBT movement and its future directions through the lens of organizations advancing policy and social change through advocacy and organizing. We purposely limited this. So we're not talking about community centers or community health centers, though we do understand that change happens there. We also focus predominantly on LGBT advocacy and policy organizations, simply due to how, frankly, how much work we could do on this issue. We need to be able to limit the groups. And we wanted to take a second to see who would be on the call with us today. So we are attempting a brief poll. And if folks would just take a second to choose which category best describes your organization. And this, again, assumes that you work for an organization, but please hit consulting or other if you don't. So take a second and please click whether or not you work at an LGBT organization that does advocacy, organizing, or legal work, LGBT organization that does service delivery, non-LGBT advocacy, organizing, or legal organization, non-LGBT service delivery, foundation or grant-making institution, consulting, or other. So we will give you a second to do that now. So it looks, way to respond very quickly. It looks like we are pretty evenly between LGBT advocacy, organizing, and legal, and non-LGBT advocacy, organizing, and legal, with the rest pretty evenly spread among foundations, grant-making, consultants, and other. A little bit less, under 5%, for LGBT organization service delivery and non-LGBT service delivery, which I think is a really helpful statement about what this report focused on and also who we're really trying to have the conversation with. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Frances, one fast reminder that the questions you can type on the bottom left hand of your screen, and we'll be getting back to them at the end.
Thanks, Rebecca. And the poll's really interesting to me as a former service provider because we need to be doing more advocacy as well. As Rebecca mentioned, this report was done by the Building Movement Project that supports and promotes nonprofits to adopt a movement-building vision and activities into their work. And we were really lucky to have these terrific consultants, Barb Masters and Gigi Barsoum, who, as you saw, previously worked in the policy department of a foundation, the California Endowment, which is the largest health foundation in the state of California, to help do the research on this project. Barb has written and presented on movement building extensively, including in the LGBT community, and Gigi has explored the use of networks, including in immigration reform. So those were really helpful additions to our work. And I also want to acknowledge that a lot of our learning came from the many people who either filled out a survey or they talked to us in interviews or they made comments on the report. So many thanks to them. Okay, so let me briefly give you the frame for the project. So there's a whole literature on movement building and on social movements, especially in sociology in the academy. And also there's a lot going on in movement building in the world right now, in case you haven't noticed. And so clearly we're still learning. And despite the arguments and the nuances, movements are multifaceted, multi-pronged efforts to create permanent social change through addressing policy, power, attitudes, and social norms. So the LGBT movement has made these amazing gains in the last decade, most recently seen in this June's Supreme Court decision on the Defense of Marriage Act. And many of us were just stunned when the President in his inaugural speech had that great line from Seneca to Selma to Stonewall. But we also know that these wins can be precarious. The Supreme Court, the same week it was striking down DOMA, dismantled the Voting Rights Act, and last year was the 40th anniversary of Roe versus Wade. And that's a really good example because the public opinion has remained steady. That is, the same percentage of people support abortion in this country over these past 40 years. There are more and more restrictions passed each year in the states, and the latest one we really paid attention to was in Texas. So it may seem that the march towards equality and equity and fairness is inevitable, but we've experienced how easily our gains can be undermined. So with that in mind, and I'm going to go to the next slide, we used a framework that actually was in a paper that Barb Masters did with Tori Osborne several years ago in a journal called Foundation Review, in case you want to look it up. The name of the paper is called Social Movements and Philanthropy, How Foundations Can Support Movement Building. And in that paper, they listed 5 elements that were kind of essential support elements to a movement. And you can see them in the top of this slide. It's vision, mobilized base, advocacy, infrastructure, leadership, and strategic alliances. But we decided in our discussions that we needed to add 2 more. One is diversity, and diversity for us included race, ethnicity, age, and gender identity. And they also wanted to add connectivity. In other words, the ways individuals and groups are connected to one another, both within the LGBT movement and with our allies. And before I turn it over to Gigi, I want to just remind you that organizations are important for the infrastructure of movements, but they are not the movement itself, which is broader than the organizations involved. In other words, strong organizations support movement building, but they can also hinder movement building if they're not flexible or they try to control the movement. So with that in mind, Gigi's going to talk about the methodology and the organizational findings.
Great. Thank you, Frances. So thank you, everyone, for joining us on the webinar today and your interest in the report. So I'm going to quickly go over, as Frances mentioned, the methodology and some of the survey findings. So the goal of our project was to develop a better understanding of the gaps, needs, capacities, and strengths of the LGBT movement, as well as to lift up ideas for the future of the movement through the lens of a cross-section of organizations. So we used a mixed methods approach, which included both quantitative and qualitative approaches, and I'll go through that with you now. So first, we started with a survey that we sent out to 62 organizations. And we had a completion rate of about 58%. But throw in the folks who skipped questions or didn't complete the full survey, we had a response rate of about 69%. We also conducted a total of 29 in-depth interviews with folks that lasted anywhere from 60 minutes to 90 minutes. And we did 17 interviews with individuals and stakeholders from within the LGBT movement. And this included LGBT organizations, grantees, and foundations and affinity groups. We also did 12 interviews with non-LGBT movement stakeholders. And the purpose of this was to gather external perspectives on the LGBT movement, as well as expertise on movement, network, and capacity building. So overall, the survey had about 34 questions. And I'm just going to quickly review the data related to the organizational profile of the survey respondents to give you a sense of the survey sample and who they were. So first, the regional distribution. So most of the groups, as you can see, were located on the coast, and we also had a cluster in the District of Columbia. Fewer number of groups were in the South and the Midwest. So I just want to note that while the survey findings that we'll be presenting today reflects this sampling of respondents, their geographic distribution mirrors that of the broader LGBT field. So we asked about the top 4 issues that organizations work on. And we got responses that ranged from civil rights issues and marriage equality to racial and economic justice issues to health-related issues. And these weren't really surprising findings considering the makeup of our respondents, which was predominantly advocacy and grassroots organizing and base building groups. So we took another cut at this data, and specifically on the issue areas, and we looked at the data based on national, state, or local positioning of the organizations, or what we then defined as geographic reach. And what we found was that aside from marriage equality, because obviously the marriage equality work now is occurring on the state level, we found that state and local groups were working more on issues of civil rights, racial justice, economic justice, and anti-violence and bullying than their national counterparts. We also asked about what populations their organizations are working on behalf of. And what we found was that the organizations that work primarily on the state and local level work on behalf of a greater diversity of populations in comparison, again, to organizations that work on the national level. And in particular, we saw that relationship with state and local organizations and their work on behalf of transgender and African American populations, as well as Latino populations and youth. We then asked about the types of non-LGBT organizations that they work with or are in coalition with to get a better understanding of collaboration and connectivity within the movement. And we found, again, a range of responses from civil rights to faith-based organizations, labor, immigrant rights organizations, and reproductive justice organizations. So then looking at the data again, based on geographic reach, we found the same trend. And we found that diversity in policy partners increased as you moved closer to the grassroots. And in particular, we saw an increase in relationships with immigrant rights organizations, labor, and racial justice organizations with state and local LGBT organizations. So again, this finding is in keeping with what we just previously discussed in terms of the correlation between state and local LGBT organizations and increased diversity in the range of issues that these organizations work on and the populations that they work on behalf of. So finally, one last data point for you on our survey respondents. We asked about their organizational operating budgets. And as you see, the majority of the organizations have an annual budget of less than $1 million. And a little more than a quarter of the organizations had annual budgets of $2 million or more. So now we're going to pose a question to all of you participating on the webinar. So selecting one answer only, what do you think is the top factor for accelerating progress for the LGBT movement? So select one option only. Is it cultivate leaders and leadership, developing a broadly shared vision, partnering with other movements, base building and community organizing, expanding organizational reach in the U.S., enhancing advocacy capacity of organizations, or investing in strategic communications? So select one option. And see, folks are still pondering this question. Okay, great. Really interesting. So a significant majority of you said partnering with other movements will help accelerate progress for the LGBT movement. And many of you also highlighted base building and community organizing. Okay, really great. So now I'm going to pass it on to Barb Masters, who's going to let you know what we found in relation to this question and what the survey respondents that answered our survey and the folks that we interviewed, what they said about what they thought would help accelerate the LGBT movement.
Thanks, Gigi. As Gigi described who we surveyed and interviewed and what the profile was of the organizations, I'm going to talk about, as Gigi mentioned, what they reported to us about the analysis, their analysis of the movement, and what its needs are for the future. Again, we used the 7-part framework to guide the questions we asked in the survey as well as in the in-depth interviews. And I'm going to quickly highlight some of our key findings related to each of these elements. So we asked our survey respondents, our survey takers, the same question we just asked you in this poll, which is, what did individuals feel were the top, and in this case we asked them to rank the top 4 factors out of a possible 13 that were most needed to accelerate the progress of the movement. And this chart represents the weighted rankings. 2 quick points to highlight in this slide. First, the highest rated elements overall were consistent with the framework, that is vision, leadership, partnering with other movements, advocacy capacity, and community organizing. There were several other factors that were not rated as highly that are not indicated in this slide. The second point, which relates in particular to the first element that I'm going to speak about, which is vision, is that shared values, principles, and a vision was ranked second and received the most #1 responses in the survey. And again, we had asked people to rank their top 4. With respect to vision, respondents in the survey were asked to describe in an open-ended question what they believe is the current vision of the LGBT movement, as well as what they would like the vision to be. And we created a word cloud to depict the themes and words that arose through those responses. And as you can see in the current vision, it relates primarily to achieving legal rights-based equality through public policy change. And marriage equality in particular was mentioned as a current focus of the movement. In contrast, when we asked what the vision should be, what they believed it should be, themes emerged which were reinforced in the interviews about broadening the vision beyond policy change and even non-discrimination. The next element to highlight is mobilized base. And base building, or having a mobilized base, is at the core of movement building. It's one of the characteristics that distinguishes a movement from a policy campaign. Although we know there's a tremendous base of LGBT people all throughout society, according to respondents and interviewees, the movement has not prioritized base building as a strategy. Moreover, only about a quarter of survey respondents reported that their base building capacity is very strong, as contrasted to about half rating their advocacy and coalition building capacities as very strong. Next is the advocacy infrastructure. And clearly there are strong anchor advocacy organizations within the LGBT movement, especially at the national level. There were also some very strong state-based organizations, but they tend to be on the coast. Interviewees described the middle and southern parts of the country, in contrast, having relatively weak advocacy capacity where it exists at all. Our findings further indicate that these advocacy organizations have high turnover of leadership and are generally more fragile. With regard to skills and capacity of the movement, respondents gave a mixed picture. This slide displays survey takers' rankings of their own skills and capacities from least to most strong. In general, they reported strong advocacy capacity with respect to legislative advocacy, public education, outreach, and coalition building, while base building and communications were the least strong. Some clear needs also emerged. In a separate question, respondents identified communications, fundraising with individual donors, and strategic planning as their top 3 organizational infrastructure capacity needs. The next element in the framework is leadership, and again, there are significant strengths and some important weaknesses. The movement has many leaders who are well-connected and politically savvy. It was interesting to note, however, that when we asked survey takers to name movement leaders, although several individuals were identified, including our last speaker, no clear consensus emerged. In many ways, this is a strength of the movement, more identification with organizations rather than a single charismatic leader. But it may also be a weakness, as it could reflect fragmentation of the movement, which we'll discuss later. But I also want to note that this is consistent with findings released earlier this year from the Pew Research Center, which conducted a nationally representative poll of nearly 2,000 self-identified LGBT adults who were asked a similar open-ended question, that is, to name the national public figure most responsible for advancing LGBT rights. And the Pew poll respondents identified President Barack Obama and next Ellen DeGeneres. No one else was named by more than 3% of the survey respondents. The next element is strategic alliances. Manuel Pastor, a noted movement building researcher, describes strategic alliances as, quote, 2 or more organizations coming together to build power to effect broader change and transform systems of power. This is a different construct than a coalition, which is much more tactical and oriented to individual policy change campaigns. It's also more resource and labor intensive and longer term. We found a growing recognition in both the survey and the interviews for the need for alliance building with other issues and movements, including immigrant rights, racial and economic justice, and reproductive justice. I believe this was identified in our poll as the highest. Working with non-LGBT allies was also highly prioritized throughout the survey in questions about leadership, advocacy capacity, and overall movement building. Many interviewees, particularly at the state and local level, are already deeply engaged in such alliance building, and several efforts are documented in the report. At the same time, however, some respondents and interviewees reported that they felt there wasn't enough support for this type of work within the movement. As Frances mentioned, we looked at diversity using a broad definition of race and ethnicity, gender and gender identity, and age. And our major finding is that as the country is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, respondents felt that the movement needed to better recognize those demographic shifts to remain relevant and influential. They recognized that although the people and the base of the LGBT movement is reflecting that diversity, the leadership is not to a large degree. This point was reinforced in the survey regarding leadership needs of the movement. Out of 12 potential leadership needs of the movement, respondents rated training people of color as the highest. Training young leaders under 35 years old and transgender and gender nonconforming leaders received ratings that were in the middle of the pack out of the 12 possible leadership needs. I would also add that when asked earlier in the slide what 4 factors or capacities are thought to be the most critical for accelerating progress of the movement, leadership, defined as including equity and diversity of leadership and people of color leaders, was selected the most time. The last element, connectivity, is critical for a movement to go to scale. Respondents reported that the LGBT movement is fragmented and siloed by issue areas, type of advocacy, and region. Although some research and data, such as polling data, are shared across the movement, competition for resources, among other reasons, inhibits better integration and coordination. Where there are connections, they are more the result of individual initiative and personal relations than formalized structures and mechanisms. There are a few opportunities, but generally state and grassroots groups don't interact much with national groups or across issues. And although there are some existing networks, such as the Equality Federation, there are few opportunities or infrastructure for real joint strategy development and visioning on an ongoing basis. The other point here that we heard is that information flow seems to be more unidirectional, that is, from national groups out, rather than national, state, and local groups mutually informing each other about what's going on, policy ideas, agenda setting, and strategy. So those are the highlights, and now I'm going to pass it back to Frances to talk about our recommendations.
Okay, thanks, Barb. And I'm going to try to quickly blow through these so we get to hear from Urvashi. So there are 3 areas that parallel our findings that we made recommendations, which are expanding the vision, strengthening the infrastructure, and facilitating connectivity. So let's start with the vision. So I just want to reiterate that the vision is different from the mission. Those of you in organizations know the mission is the problem you're trying to solve, but the vision is the world you want to create. It's a roadmap that may include detours, but it's essential in helping us go forward. So to move closer to achieving the vision that movement and organizational leaders said they desired, we made 2 very basic recommendations. And the first is that we believe that the, let me just get to the next slide. Sorry. Okay, that we believe that the LGBT movement needs to be more intentional about creating and seeding an expanded vision. That doesn't mean everyone agrees on all aspects of the movement or all our strategies, but it does mean that we're in relation with one another and having the conversation. So one way to do that, not the only way, is to bring people together in structured conversations on how to define the vision, grounding it in the work being done and the lived experience of the LGBT base. Coming together should balance kind of, on the one hand, expansiveness, such as convenings in different regions and having multiple convenings, but also relationship building, which is deepening our relationships and meeting more than one time. So if we have these sorts of convenings, it will also catalyze new relationships and collaborations, promote learning and strategy development, foster more cohesion, and result in newer and more policy priorities. Second, the work on vision doesn't need to be at the expense of targeted policy goals. Policies codify and advance social change. However, the policy fight should align with the broader vision. In other words, policy goals are in service of the larger vision. They aren't the vision. They're one of several strategies and tactics. The second area, there were 3 key elements that were crucial in our second recommendation, and that's strengthening the infrastructure of the LGBT movement. So there needs to be more attention to building the capacity of LGBT people of color in the LGBT movement. And we're talking about organizations, we're talking about leaders, and we're talking about constituents and the base. So we recommend looking at evidence of that focus, which could be seen in the financial investment in these groups, the capacity building and development of groups and individuals, and the change in visibility of LGBT people of color in the LGBT movement, including hiring leaders of color to head LGBT organizations. Now, this issue is not just an issue in the LGBT community. Compass Point does since 2001, does a report called Daring to Lead. They do it every 5 years, and they have a sample of nonprofit leaders from across the country. So in 2001, 17% of the leaders were people of color. In 2006, 17% of the people were people of color. In 2011, they didn't even put it in the report, but 18% of the leaders were leaders of color. So these findings show that there's no change despite a decade of training on diversity and cultural competency, as well as training for more diverse leadership. So training and capacity building aren't enough. The community also should identify the barriers to people of color visibility and leadership and then address those barriers. Again, evidence-based. Second, turning to the, sorry, taking a minute to get to that next slide. There we go. Turning to advocacy infrastructure, we recommend that the LGBT movement develop in 3 areas in terms of advocacy infrastructure. Though many of you thought that was not an important issue, but I'm still going to say what we recommend. So regionally, we need to invest and strengthen fragile local and state-based LGBT organizations to become more stable and effective advocates, especially in the middle and south of the country. Secondly, there should be tailored capacity building, which kind of moves towards what people need, whether it's technical assistance, peer learning, and culture, and meets the unique needs of each organization. And third, there should be coordination where groups collaborate with each other and with capacity building organizations on providing support. This sort of capacity building could be done through existing organizational hubs, or we may need to create some new ones, but they focus on areas such as communications, you saw from Barb's slide, research and data, that would serve local, state, and regional groups, as well as offer consistent, high-quality information. And the result would be a stronger advocacy field. And third, our third recommendation in infrastructure is to recognize and start to create some strength for organizing and advocacy in areas outside of the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and West Coast. Many of these groups, from what we heard, need basic organizational capacity building. That instead of advocacy capacity building, they need organizational capacity building, which is like board development and training, organizational and resident leadership training, fundraising support, and we know these investments take time, so the sooner they start, the greater the payoff. Our last recommendation area was to facilitate connectivity both within the LGBT movement and with allies. So within the LGBT movement, we believe there's an untapped potential to build and strengthen the base and to connect the movement from the local through to the larger and, quite frankly, often the most well-funded organizations, which are the national groups. First, base building can be enhanced by making visible and strengthening already existing organizing groups and seeding more, but also by tapping local groups such as service providers, cultural organizations, and informal associations, which are all entry points for the LGBT community. Working with these groups can expand the number of local leaders and others dedicated to making change. Extending the base should be done in coordination with policy and advocacy groups at all levels, whether it's local, state, or national. In this way, the participants receive the information they need to be effective, and the policy and advocacy groups can hear the real and current issues and interests of a wider number of LGBT people. And finally, we saw in the findings that Gigi presented that local LGBT organizations often work more closely with non-LGBT allies on multiple issues. And we see more of this happening on the state and federal level as well. Funders are also starting to recognize the importance of cross-issue work, but we heard that alliance building needs more support, and we agree. Alliances produce a platform and base of support for all our issues, and they create possibilities, including new frames and narratives that benefit the LGBT community and our sister movements. And finally, we thought that there were areas that really needed further study and documentation to extend the work. And I'm just going to name 3. First, the report was mostly focused on policy change. That's advocacy groups and organizers. So we missed the voices of service providers and others who often are more directly connected to LGBT youth, people of color, and working class LGBT people. To broaden the vision, those voices will be critical. Second, the LGBT movement has drawn on and compared itself to other progressive movements, but there's little research on the relationships between movements or analysis of how they work together. So we should be documenting successes and unsuccessful alliances to learn and explore how to bridge movements and create long-term alliances. And third, we know that many of the recommendations we are making are not new. We're certainly not the first group to raise issues such as the relative absence of leaders of color and the limited capacity of groups in the middle of the country. We need to look more closely at and address the long-standing obstacles to implementing these changes. So before I turn it over to Urvashi, we just wanted to get your sense of, if you had to choose one, what do you think, what recommendation do you think should be given the highest priority? Expanding the current vision, strengthening the infrastructure, connecting within the LGBT movement, or something else? Those are the, connecting within and across the LGBT movement, I probably should say. So let's quickly do a poll on that, and then we're going to move on to the comment. Okay, so I'm going to wait just 1 minute more since people are okay. So I think we're done, and you can see that we're equally divided between expanding the vision and the infrastructure, a little bit less on the connectivity. Maybe we're already connected. So with that, let me turn it over to Urvashi Vaid. And I just really want to thank her for agreeing to comment on this. And if you haven't read her latest book, Irresistible Revolution, Confronting Race, Class, and the Assumptions of LGBT Politics, go buy it right away. I know when I read it, it really helped us with the analysis and addresses many of the issues we're talking about. So Urvashi, take it away.
Thank you, Frances, and everybody for being here and for this interesting presentation. What I want to do in just about 10 minutes is to add some additional context to this conversation. I thought we would start with some observations that I want to make about the movement situation, where it is today, and then focus in on a case study. What would it take to implement some of the desires that participants had and that they identified, as well as the recommendations that the report authors made? What would it take to implement those? So to refresh, the interviewees in this report identified 4 needs: the need to define a new vision, to extend and diversify base building, to strengthen infrastructure, to deepen alliances. And the report's authors recommended 3 things: expand the vision, strengthen the infrastructure, and facilitate connectivity. What would it take to do these things? The first thing I wanted to share was a slide that I created that frames the context for the LGBT work that we're doing. What have we been working against? What have we been fighting to change? We've essentially been fighting against 4 big arguments about homosexuality: that we were criminal, that we're sick, that we're sinful, that we're immoral. And the bubbles on the right, you see how relatively recently some of these struggles have been turned around. And I would submit, as you all know, because you're all activists on this call, that we're still up against each of these arguments in the U.S. and globally. This slide is an interesting graphic that came from the Guardian newspaper. And what I use it to demonstrate is some observations about the movement today. Today, the legal strategy is dominant in the LGBT movement. We've had big wins. But the cases determine the policy agenda. What's winnable legally gets pursued politically. Politics is about a lot of insider moneyball. It's a very access-driven thing. It's very much driven by people who are influencing and informing politicians. National organizations are larger than ever. The 40 largest national state organizations in the movement now employ about 800 people and have a combined budget of more than $150 million, according to the Movement Advancement Project, whose data you can get online at lgbtmap.org. Funders, to a large extent, dictate the agenda of the movement. Direct action remains pretty weak right now, and there is a split between the racial justice, POC, trans-focused advocates and others. There's not a focus on women's rights. And contrary to what some of the data suggested in the reports and the self-reporting in this survey, I would submit that we don't really have an economic policy focus across the movement, although people are talking about it. In fact, the biggest critical question that appears to be facing the current movement is this difference between lived equality as a goal or legal equality as a goal. Now, we all know that they're not mutually exclusive. One needs legal equality. I've spent my life trying to pursue it, and it's essential to everything we want. However, the endpoint of a legal equality goal is different than the endpoint of a lived equality goal. And I think that is made most vivid in some of the data that is now emerging from think tanks and from government entities that are now documenting the lives of LGBT people a little bit more. The lived experience of many people in the LGBT community remains an experience of poverty, an experience of struggle and economic hardship, among other realities of homophobia and gender-based phobia and racism. One of the things I think that's going on is that one of the reasons I think there is this difference in opinion between lived equality and legal equality is the assumptions behind the theory of change we've been using in the movement. The theory of change is that legal and policy change will affect all people equally, it will lead to cultural and societal change, and then LGBT people will be free. It does work, this theory of change. It's an effective theory of change. However, I think what it leaves out are the ways that race and economic inequality and gender, among other things, intersect with some of the legal and policy environments and societal and traditional and religion and culture to produce the homophobia and transphobia we experience in our lives. The assumptions are ignored in the current theory of change. Just as an aside, I thought it was interesting to me, it's always been interesting living through the movement for 30 years to see the changes in the LGBT movement's view of the state and its relationship to the state and the role of government. We used to, when I started out, it was all about government out of our lives. Then it was government, we demanded a fair share of government. And then it was government should save our lives in the epidemic, AIDS epidemic at its height in the 80s. And then government should affirm our lives, which is what we are pursuing now. But all of these are undergirded by a certain attitude or idea about what the government owes us, what we expect from our government, and that's interesting to foreground because it's, again, we're doing this in the context of a larger political attack on government and a shrinking of government at the very instant that our community is seeking a bit more of the kinds of resources it never got from government. So the Southern Case Study, applying the recommendations of the report, broadening the vision, extending base building, and deepening alliances, for example, look at the status of LGBT rights in the South. A lot of these charts are from Wikipedia. There's constitutional bans, there's very few employment, there's no employment discrimination laws. The gray in the South represents that. There's no housing discrimination laws. If you look at the status of other civil rights issues, the right to work laws, which prohibit union agreements, are all these green laws there. There's anti-immigration laws across the country. And the South is the epicenter of the HIV epidemic in many ways. The South has incredibly negative, come on screen, please change, yes, abortion laws. There's parental consent laws. There's mandatory waiting period laws. There's mandatory ultrasound laws that are being promoted or exist. And the South also has a very high percentage of voter disenfranchisement of African Americans due to felony convictions. That's a chart from the Sentencing Project. The South's unemployment rates, I pulled these numbers from the Economic Policy Institute and just put them on the chart. So the question becomes, what would it take to do base building or to broaden a vision or to build alliances in a region in that larger context? I think one would have to think about base building, for example, more around values or shared values that we have with the people living in that region or the people living in those states, not just shared identities, because the number of LGBT people in the South are going to be small, in proportion to what we need to win. traditional affinities through which we've built bases may not be helpful for the LGBT issue. On the vision side, are funders and activists willing to take on so-called non-LGBT issues? Because I think that when you look at working in a region like the South, they're so interconnected. The same obstacles exist for women's rights as exist for gay rights, as exist for racial justice and immigrant rights. Alliances, it's curious that so many people reported so many alliances in the data, and yet experience indicates how limited and local some of those alliances are. Faith communities were undernoted in many of the research findings, and I think that that's an important, critically important constituency in the South. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that when you look at the elements of LGBT capacity in the South, organizations, elected officials, the population of LGBT people, when you look at the municipalities in the South that are rated by HRC as being higher on the scale and having policies, laws, and services for LGBT people, you see very few localities. You see some cities in the South that are highly rated, but others that aren't. When you look at this, the question becomes what infrastructure is really needed to advance in that region? Is it a state-based infrastructure like we have in New York State or California or Massachusetts with mass equality? Or is it more of a regional infrastructure that's needed? Or both? Is it LGBT rights focused or is it intersectional? Will it be funded by the gay donors or by progressives? What will we do about political capacity? The questions that come up for me are questions that come up about shared or divergent goals. I think that this whole notion of building a shared vision, I have to say after all these years of organizing, I'm not so sure that LGBT people across the board will share a vision beyond the basic rights agenda. However, we can share goals and objectives, and that's how we've been winning. We have agreed on a set of goals, and we have gone for them. In a region like the South, or any part of the country with limited rights, if we agree on a set of goals and agree on a strategy, then we can go for it. However, the problem remains the availability of funding. And if you look at this funding chart that I pulled from the Funders for Lesbian and Gay Issues data, again, 40 of the largest groups had a large amount of revenue. 279 donors gave $25,000 or more, which is very generous. Only 260,000 people gave to these 40 organizations. That's a tiny fraction of the 8 million LGBT people that exist according to the Williams Institute. So we have a very small number of people funding the movement, which gives them disproportionate impact and control. In addition, the kinds of quote, populations, unquote, funded by LGBT supporting foundations, the general approach is to fund LGBT people in general. But what happens is that particular populations, be they people of color populations, be they aging communities, be they poor people, poor LGBT people of all colors, be they immigrants, those populations tend to get lost in the generic general funding. And that's what I think leads to some of the gap between the grassroots groups that in this study reported the desire for more leadership, of different kinds of leadership, and the lack of funding that's going to support and nurture and develop and sustain that leadership. The final slide, I think it's a little out of order, but I was going to show it earlier, again from the Williams Institute. The assumption around a lot of the coverage around marriage equality is that it's coverage that affects middle class and upper middle class people. The truth is that it affects a lot of different kinds of people in our communities. So I guess the data and the questions that I'm raising to provide a context for the study really come down to how do we move a movement to change? There seems to be a desire for change on the part of the people who participated in this study, and certainly a movement has to change to adapt to different realities. But how do we in fact change a movement from a narrow gay rights focused agenda to one that's focused on the lived experience of LGBT people, which requires us to take on a number of different issues? Thank you. Hello?
Hey, Rebecca, are you there? Yeah.
Yep.
Hi.
Sorry, my phone is having a bad day. With this, we're going to turn to the question and answer period of the call. We only have, unfortunately, about 6 minutes, but I wanted to say that first of all, the slides are going to be sent out, so you'll have that chance. And again, you can always be tweeting these questions at Building Movement, or most importantly, on the left side of your screen. So you've actually already gotten a couple of questions in, so I'm going to read them out loud and have the presenters respond. Heather Kronk asks, if coalition building with non-LGBT groups is so strong when self-assessed, how would you all respond to the need that coalition building with non-LGBT groups was the top thing identified as a need? And Barb?
Sure.
You have a response to that?
Yeah, well, I think there are two responses. The first is I do think we need to recognize that there can be a bias in self-assessments about capacities and skills, which may be reflected in that response. But second, I think it also reflects that even if coalitions by some respondents, even if some respondents said that their coalitions with non-LGBT allies are strong, I think what this says is there is recognition that much more needs to be done and they need to be strengthened in a much more significant way.
Hi, this is Frances. I was just going to say that I do think there's an issue with the self-reports, as we knew. I mean, we asked groups what they thought we were doing. We saw it especially in when we presented the early findings of the report at Creating Change. Many people challenged the fact that so many groups said they worked on trans issues, when in fact people, especially local people, were saying they were having trouble finding services and support for trans issues. So I think that often those self-reports are aspirations, but not completely, they might not reflect the total objective reality we might see in a different type of study.
Great. I'm going to move us on to the next question. Cynthia Renfro asks, were there groups that did not have a target population? It's interesting to note this in relation to groups that did. Gigi or Barb?
Yeah, so I actually sent the answer out. And yes, there were groups, about 17% of them, that said that they didn't have a specific target population. And I think that probably reflects some of the respondents, particularly some of the legal advocacy organizations.
And I'm going to combine the last two questions into one because I think it's a good question to end on with our last few minutes. And this is a combination of a question from Adam Dyer and Bob Fulkerson. And I'm going to turn this over to Irv and Frances. But the question is, how do we address these issues, and where does this discussion go now in the movement? Irv or Frances?
I think that you address the parts of the movement are working actively on religious coalition building and organizing. I think that needs to be strengthened and supported. The work on race and racial justice is bifurcated with people of color organizations and a handful of non-POC organizations prioritizing that work, and the rest of the movement not really prioritizing that work. I've spent a lot of time trying to change that dynamic, and I think the funders can be very influential in that. And the economic issues and creating a policy agenda and a litigation strategy and a lobbying agenda that takes into account the needs of working people, of low-income LGBT people, is something that absolutely could be done. The think tanks that we have could help us develop those policy goals and do that. So I think it's all very practical and doable.
And I'm just going to add to that. I agree with Urvashi. It's practical and it's doable. And if we don't move in that direction, I think we're going to cease having the types of wins that we've had in the past. In other words, the country's changing. There's a greater division between the haves and the have-nots. It's soon going to be a majority people of color country. So, you know, it's not. I think we're going to be forced by the changes of demographics and in income equality to start addressing issues that maybe to this point we were able to win and ignore. And with that, I think, Rebecca, was there one more question?
I actually didn't get the last question in on time, so I'm going to answer that. Megan, if you're still on, I'm going to answer that offline. Francis, do you want to just say how the report's going to be?
Yeah, so let me just say you can go to download the full report. You can go to our website, www.buildingmovement.org. All of you on the call will receive a PDF of the PowerPoint, and if you want a recording, a link to the recording, you can get that too. We hope you will continue the conversation with us both through Twitter, but also just keeping in touch with us, and we'll let you know what's happening in the future. So thanks very much. We really appreciated all of you being on the call. Thanks to Urvashi for her comments, and to the authors and to Rebecca, and we wish you a terrific day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Please stand by.